Angry protests across Iran as the country faces economic turmoil. The president is calling on the government to hear the protesters' demands. But who's to blame for Iran's deep economic crisis, and how far will the demonstrations go? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Yet again, Iran is facing another wave of public anger. Thousands of Iranians have been protesting as a dire economic crisis takes a heavy toll on their daily livelihood. From a sharp fall in the currency's value to an unprecedented rise in inflation, Iran's economy has reached what many describe as a breaking point. This time, the government has adopted a different approach as the protests continue, calling for a dialogue mechanism. But as the country reels from long-standing sanctions, what does the leadership have to offer? And what would be the consequences if the protests escalate? We'll get to our guest to try and answer those questions in a moment. But first, this report from Michael Apple.
A lone protester faces off with security forces in western Iran after days of mostly peaceful rallies. The demonstrations about a cost of living crisis are among the largest in years. They were sparked by shopkeepers in Tehran closing their stores in protest against rising living costs.
If the government could, instead of just focusing on fuel, look at bringing down the price of other goods. Dairy products have gone up 6 times this year, and other goods more than 10 times.
Soon, students from several universities joined the demonstrations, with economic grievances giving way in some places to anti-government chanting. The Iranian government responded.
Listening to the voice of the people, even when their protests are harsh, is the duty of the government.
That message strikes a more conciliatory tone in Iran. Experts believe it may be an acknowledgement of just how dire conditions are. Here's the economic situation in Iran at the moment. The local currency has plummeted by more than 70% in a year to 1.4 million rials to the US dollar. The loss in purchasing power has led to skyrocketing inflation of about 50%, while the price of basic food and medical items has risen by as much as 70%. The protests have led to the resignation of Iran's central bank governor, who's being replaced by this man, Abdul Nasser Hemati, a former finance minister. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is urging unity in the face of what he calls a full-scale war.
Right now, the enemy has placed most of its hopes on knocking us down through economic pressure. You cannot conquer a nation with bombs, fighter jets or missiles. To defeat us, they would have to come and face us on the ground.
Iran's problems are multifaceted, from power cuts to air pollution. It's also trying to recover from June's Israeli bombing campaign and US strikes on its nuclear facilities. And there are more threats on the horizon.
Iran may be behaving badly.
Add decades of ever tougher sanctions from Washington to the mix, and it's an economy that's barely moving. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's try and find out more about this subject in detail with our guest today. In Tehran, we have Ali Akbar Dareini, a researcher at the Centre for Strategic Studies. In Ottawa, in Canada, Marzie Khalilian, political analyst and academic researcher. And in Christchurch, New Zealand, Stephen Zunes, Professor of Politics and founding chair of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of San Francisco. Thank you very much for all of you joining us today on Inside Story. Let me start with you, Ali Akbar, because you're there in Tehran. You're experiencing this firsthand. How significant are these protests? Because they're clearly the largest in 3 years.
These are significant protests, of course, very limited at this point. It started with merchants and traders closing up their shops in the Grand Bazaar to protest high living prices in 42% inflation. So they are protesting against mismanagement and high inflation. That is one part of the stories. They took to the streets. There were peaceful protests, and the response from the government was very wise. It recognized the protests and set up a dialogue mechanism in order to bring about a common understanding in order to solve the problem. But at the same time, in a population of, let's say, 400 protesters, there are 3, 4, 5 individuals who are trained and are not part of the protest. They are not merchants. They are not traders. They are trying to incite violence and turn the peaceful protests into a bloody conflict. That has not happened. The government is very serious to recognize the protests and talk to the protesters. This is a legitimate protest against mismanagement, corruption, and high inflation.
OK, let me bring in Marzie now, if I can. Marzie, how worried should the authorities be that this might get out of hand?
Well, that would be very difficult to predict. But what we understand is what causes this protest. I think what the government should be worried about is actually that the underlying factor of what causes this protest, which is the economic factor, which is the economic pressure that is felt by everyday Iranians. With the UN sanctions recently being imposed on Iran and the cost of living, what the other guest mentioned, there is likely that these protests keep happening because what the protesters are asking for simply is survival, is to be able to bring food to the table.
Stephen, I mean, we've heard from Ali Akbar about the trigger for this. These economic figures, if you look at them, are pretty shocking, aren't they? The Iranian currency, the rial's value against the dollar has dropped by more than 56% in just 6 months. And the inflation rate has risen to more than 42%. Any country, the government will be having problems with these sort of economic statistics.
Very much so. And what's significant about these protests, in my view, is that it's the bazaris. It is the small business people who historically have been the backbone of the revolution, of the government, going back to the anti-Shah protests in the late 1970s. And so when they lose the bazaris, they're in trouble. Also, it's clear that these protests are including a lot of people from the poor working class segments, also who tend to be fairly conservative and supportive of the government. Previous demonstrations have been disproportionately middle class intellectuals. And so this is a much more broad-based protest than we have seen before, both in terms of the class, but also in terms of geography. These protests are breaking out all over. So this is quite a serious challenge to the regime, and it's the economic problems are not the things that can be addressed simply by getting a new leader of the central bank or some minor adjustments in fiscal policies. This is a lot more serious. It's a lot more systemic.
Ali Akbar, so we're talking here not about ideology this time, but economic survival for ordinary Iranians. And the point that Stephen just made there about the shopkeepers, the ordinary people and the students. I mean, I'm perhaps feeling an echo of 1978 and 1979 because they were the people who powered the Iranian revolution. Do you think that there's that worry in terms of the leadership?
Devaluation of real and increasing economic pressures on the population has angered many Iranians. That is legitimate protest. The bazaris who took to the streets, they have legitimate grievances against the state. That is well understood. At the same time, while the government is trying to respond adequately to the legitimate protests, it is also concerned about illegal rioting and efforts by specific individuals aimed at destabilizing the state. There is a very clear difference between legitimate protests and destabilizing the state. It's very obvious that Israel and the United States would like these peaceful protests to turn into a bloody civil war. They are looking for Iran to become a failed state. They wish very much that they will be able to help turn Syrianize or Libyanize Iran. That is the plan. And the government in Tehran is very concerned about that, but it has been very careful to respond appropriately and professionally to the legitimate concerns. So far, the limited protests have been responded with a careful behavior from the government. At the same time, protesters do not have too much faith in the government itself. President Pezeshkian has been promising to solve the problems. At the same time, sometimes he says he cannot solve the problems. But to make it short, so far the response from the authorities has been to listen to the protesters and find solutions.
OK, Marzie, is that response going to work, this conciliatory response? The president on X on Monday, the livelihood of the people is my daily concern. He's sympathising with the protesters at this stage, and they've also replaced the head of the central bank. I note, though, that the new head of the central bank, Abdul Nasser Hamati, was previously the finance minister and then was kicked out of the job earlier this year by the parliament. So question marks are whether he's the right man.
Well, the government has done limited economic gestures. There have been promises of oversight, some temporary controls, and there are also like public messagings aimed at calming market like the tweet that you just mentioned. But there hasn't been any structural economic reliefs. And again, what we need to understand here is, yes, government is responsible. Yes, government can do something. But what the government can do is very much limited in the space that the sanction allows the government. The biggest problem, the biggest issue here for the Iranian government are caused by the sanctions. And we saw the devaluation of Iranian money after the imposition of the UN sanctions. So yes, government can do something, but their actions are extremely limited because it is the sanctions that are harming Iranian economy. Government can do only so much with such heavy sanctions imposed on the country.
Stephen, I mean, do you think the fact they've taken this approach, or certainly the president has taken this approach of a conciliatory approach, reaching out to the protesters, shows that they realise what a serious position they're in? And add to that the fact that Iran is a complex system. The president has certain powers, but there are other power centres too. Do you think there'll be some who'll be advocating a more hardline response to this?
Certainly, we've seen the CGs, the hardline elements, crack down really brutally against previous protests. President Pezeshkian is a relative moderate, but let's remember he's not really the one who has the power. Most of the power is in the hands of the clerics and the military. If things get much bigger than they are, if it actually does seem to be a threat to the stability of the regime, I have no doubt they're going to crack down really hard, and there's going to be a very severe repression. And, they can talk about, how Israel and the United States is manipulating things. And of course, both Israel and the United States would try to take advantage of it. But this is a very much of a homegrown uprising. This is based on domestic policies. And while the sanctions certainly exacerbate the problem, the people are recognizing that much of the problem is based in the structural inherencies within the regime and its policies.
Ali Akbar, when you listen to what people are chanting on the streets, in some cases we've seen social media with death to the dictator or woman, life, freedom. Do you think there is a tipping point where at a certain point there will be a much tougher response?
There is a very clear difference between legitimate protests and destabilizing the state or trying to incite violence and provoke police into a harsh reaction. The law has clarified that. As long as people are protesting against high inflation, high costs of living, and mismanagement, or chant slogans against the government, that is fine. It's legitimate protest, and there will be no harsh response. But attacking police stations, setting public property on fire, taking up arms against the state, and resorting to violence, that is not acceptable. And every state has the right to make sure that the country is not destabilized. Iran knows very well that Israel is looking for useful idiots in the streets in Tehran. A majority of the protesters are protesting simply because some of them can't make their ends meet. They are under strong economic pressures, high inflation. But there are individual elements who have been trained and they are working to incite violence and turn the peaceful protests into a broader protest and into a bloody conflict.
Okay, let me bring in Marzie on that point, if I can, Ali Akbar. Marzie, there are some reports, some Western media reports, I'm talking about the chants that have been put out there, that some people are chanting, "Long live the Shah." Now, tell us what is your impression on that, because we know the Shah's son lives in the United States. Is there any real support within Iran for a return to the monarchy, or is that something that's being pushed by certain elements here?
Well, there are slogans, there are people demanding something political. But again, what we need to understand is what actually brought people to the street is not this slogan, it's survival. What the demand of the people is to lower the cost of the living. It inevitably might become political, because when there is not like the instructional challenge that absorbs frustration, it might become political. That's understandable. But the political slogan, it's not something unified. It's not something that is said and it's not something that's said by everybody on the street. What is the cost of living? Is survival. That's what people are asking for. That's what people want in this round of protests.
OK, Stephen, pick that up. That's what people want. Can the government even deliver that, given the scale of the problems, the crippling international sanctions, the long-term mismanagement, the huge reconstruction costs after the June bombardment by the US and Israel? Is a solution actually beyond the control of the government, or are the solutions politically unpalatable for the government?
I think what the people really are demanding here is accountability. And if you don't have accountability for a government on economic issues or anything else, people are going to be upset, because they are not really interested in the will of the people or winning their support, but maintaining their own power and influence. So I really do think that this is going to evolve into a broader pro-democracy kind of revolution. Because, again, I really don't think the system, despite reformers like the current president, are really capable of doing this. And that's also why I don't think the monarchists are any more than a tiny percentage of the population. I don't think people want to trade one autocratic regime for another. But I agree that this is not something that the current system is going to be able to address. And we are maybe seeing the beginnings of a major effort to try to change the regime, or at least to force some pretty radical levels of democratization within the system.
Ali Akbar, there is a danger things may get worse. I see there's a new tier in gasoline pricing, which some say is going to put up inflation further. There are concurrent crises as well as the economy. You have power cuts. You have a severe water shortage. The president even openly hinting that people might have to evacuate Tehran. And, of course, the security situation. Iran was long seen as a regional power with its rather unique system of alliances with groups, the so-called axis of resistance. Now, you could argue Iran is probably the weakest it's been at any time since the Iran-Iraq war nearly 40 years ago.
I disagree. Has Iran been weakened economically? Yes. Has Iran's problems have increased in recent years? Yes, that's true. There is public discontent. And part of it is due to mismanagement, part of it is due to sanctions and foreign intervention, foreign incitement. This is a fact. I cannot deny those facts. But to depict Iran as a country that is almost in turmoil, no, this is not the case. I do follow the social media, the anti-Iran satellite TV stations. What they depict is very much different from what I can see in the streets of Tehran since I'm living in the capital, Tehran. So, there are accumulated social and economic problems that has made the people angry. That's something every expert will agree to. And I agree to that as well. But there are specific solutions to that. Whether the government is able to provide adequate solutions in a short period of time, we have to wait and see. But there are specific proposals to Pezeshkian's government. Experts have come up with certain proposals. But some problems can be resolved only in the long term. You have the issue of sanctions, and you have omnibalancing, meaning that Iran's enemies focus on Iran's internal vulnerabilities, trying to incite violence and destabilize the country. The authorities are very much prepared to deal with that. They are concerned about that, and they are making every effort to make sure that protests will remain peaceful and the government will be able to deal with them adequately and talk to the protesters and provide adequate answers to their grievances.
OK, Marzie, Ali Akbar there mentions sanctions. That clearly is one option for the government to try and get fresh negotiations, try and get those international sanctions, which have got tighter with the snapback at the UN in recent months. Is Iran prepared for negotiations? There seemed to be some sort of olive branch coming from the Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. But of course, Iran feels it was fooled back in June because it was actively negotiating when it was bombed.
Well, yes, that is an important factor to consider, the issue of trust. But it's also important to understand that at the moment, both sides, they have incentive, but also there is deep constraint. Iran obviously needs economic relief, and the US faces domestic and regional political limits. So that does make negotiation possible, but very, very fragile. And again, let's look at the issue of trust. Exactly as you said, Iran was actively negotiating when it was bombed. And not to mention that Iran did give up part of its nuclear activities in response for sanction relief, which never happened, which the Western power never delivered their side of the agreement. So there is that. There is the issue of trust. There is that question by the Iranian, not just the Iranian government, but also the Iranian people. So why should we again do something that did not work? Why should we again do something that we tried so hard? We complied, we did everything, we did our part of the agreement, but we didn't receive what was promised to us. Well,
Stephen, what's your view? Do you think Iran should try and reach out to the US and trust the US this time? Of course, President Trump in recent days has been with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It seems there's not talk of fresh peace efforts, but talk of fresh war. Prime Minister Netanyahu stressing that maybe they've done something to an extent about the nuclear program, but now stressing Iran's ballistic missiles are a threat.
Iran has indeed compromised on a whole number of levels in the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which the United States unilaterally broke off despite full Iranian compliance. They have sought more recent compromises as well. So there's very good reason to distrust the United States because the U.S. is going to find some reason to try to challenge Iran. Now, there are many legitimate criticisms of the Iranian regime, both in terms of its domestic repression and its support for extremist groups and the like. But the main reason the United States opposes Iran is not for those reasons. After all, some of America's closest allies are also autocratic regimes that have supported extremist groups. But it's because Iran is daring to challenge U.S. hegemony in the region. It's the most powerful actor that is not willing to go along with U.S. prerogatives, and that's why Iran is targeted. Having said that, I do think that ironically, in certain ways, the sanctions have helped the regime because they've used them as an excuse for the economic problems, when in fact there are indeed more serious problems that are the fault of the system itself and the leadership themselves, and that and it's not simply the sanctions that are causing such problems in the economy.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all of our guests on today's Inside Story, Ali Akbar, Dareini, Marzie, Khalilian and Stephen Zunes. Stay tuned to Al Jazeera for the latest reporting from our team in Iran, with even more context and commentary at aljazeera.com. We'd like your views too. Go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X. Just look for @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and all the production team here in Doha. Stay safe. Bye-bye for now.